Well, I'm not sure if we're able to hear Darryl. Hang on just a minute. Let's see if we can get his audio turned on. My apologies.
Yeah, I'm right here.
There we go. Thanks, Darryl. You ready to get started?
Sure am.
Great. Well, rock and roll. I'll just hand over the reins to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, James. As James mentioned, my name is Darryl Rayner. Here, as soon as the screen paints, you should see the general discussion or abstract. This is what was posted and probably what drew you to the webinar. We'll take a look for just a moment at my background and why am I here discussing PMOs. Two reasons, really. One, because I care about them, and I see them done badly often. And another reason is that I've participated in several PMOs, a couple of Fortune 500 firms, and I was the co-founder of the Rational Software prior to the sale to IBM of the PMO there. And as you may or may not know, Rational was a large software house, had about 2,500 programmers, another 500 reasonably technical people, and another 500 support, sales, and management folks. And the PMO had dotted line responsibility to all projects and primary responsibility for the largest projects in the company. We had a staff of 3 for about 3,000 people. And we were able to come in and make some really neat changes and reduce the overhead burden. And I think most people would say it was a very effective PMO. So later on, past that, I've done consulting for several other organizations. And I've really been a student of PMOs, and I've watched them, and there's a lot of rhetoric around a PMO. A lot of times they really aren't relevant. For instance, I'm dealing with about 4 clients right now, and in 3 of my clients, they have PMOs, and they're really not relevant. They're sort of a compliance arm, sort of a consulting organization, and sort of the type of organization that helps people with senior level project managers that deal with projects across the board. So since then, I've really been interested in helping people set up and maintain relevance in their PMOs because they can be a great leverage point with just a few people, right? In the presentation, James will be helping me out. If anyone has a question or any other type of comment, please feel free to type it in, and he'll be monitoring those and alert me to a great question or something. Potentially, your comments are just as valuable or more valuable than mine, and the real reason for this presentation is for you, not for me. So please feel free to comment at any time. Our agenda, introductions, we're pretty much through that right now. There's a couple of concepts that I think you'll feel after this presentation that are key to maintaining relevance with your PMO, right? One is front-loading your projects with conflict. It may seem counterintuitive, but you want to make your decisions once up front and not multiple times throughout a project, right? Also, make sure that you have set up and reviewed your processes and make sure that they have value. And we'll go over a couple of ways to do that. Lastly, build an implementation plan for these. Don't just direct that they come into being, right? Then we'll have a brief summary, and we'll for sure make time for questions. Sometimes that's the best part, right? So we have a varied group here that are attending, all different types of organizations, different sizes, different interests. In a little bit, we'll do a little bit of a poll to see where everybody sits with their PMOs. And it's anonymous, and we'll just present the summary information as part of this presentation here, right? So our firm, Data Analysis and Results, is all about helping people get their projects done. You can do that a couple of ways, right? We can come in and help with a failing project or a non-performing project, dealing with the processes. We're really process-oriented. And we can also help organize and optimize your projects and your project processes. So all the other sides of our practice are geared toward having you not call us in to help with your failing projects, right, to keep you in the black, so to speak. So we have a couple of major pieces here, right? PMO formation. Some of you may be in that stage where you're forming or reforming. You may also be in the rationalization stage of a PMO. A lot of times PMOs come into existence because there's some big problem or big challenge, and they're brought together, a lot of resources are thrown in it, some pretty good talent. Then you fix that problem, or you solve that challenge, and then people in PMO sort of start looking around for other things to do, and there's lots of other things to do in organizations, and that's where things start to come apart a little bit, right? So we really love to help people pare down their processes, to concentrate on what matters, so it's easy and easier for everyone, right? So here we are in the conflict. Why would you want to front load your project with conflict, right? Because it's faster. Otherwise, the conflict goes underground. You may have situations where people are forming coalitions, and then there's debate throughout the life of a project, right? There's a couple of ways to get really high productivity out of a project. The medium-term road is to take a look at all your processes and optimize all your processes, you know, one by one all the time, and that's very valuable. The other big way to get huge productivity gains out of your projects is to set up a couple simple processes, front load your project with conflict, which does one main thing. It keeps you from working on the wrong deliverables. The wrong deliverables are classified as either low value, or they're deliverables that wouldn't absolutely have to take place in that project at all. And they may even be cut from a scope perspective later in the project. So any amount of time at all that you've worked on them from a project perspective is wasted. So there's perhaps the highest level productivity possible on a project is to not work on the wrong stuff, right? So one of the best ways to front load a little bit of professional and reasonable conflict in your project is to make tailoring your project processes mandatory. Every process should not be executed on every project with the same amount of zeal. In fact, some processes don't even make any sense on some projects, right? So a lot of times what happens is that people sort of give lip service or ignore some processes without actually coming out and stating that this is what we need to do and this is what we need to not do. We just kind of let it slide by, which causes all kinds of conflict later in the project over and over and over. It's much better to get the team together, take a look at all the processes that you're asked or that you think you should execute, make a list, and then go through and prioritize those processes right up on top of the table and make a recommendation and a persuasive presentation to put most of the work where most of the value is and less work where less value is, down to and including the processes that you do not feel are necessary for this particular project. Right? Use the top of the table. Put it right out there. Make it part of your project process to tailor processes, figure out what's going to work. Right? Project processes are work too. You have other work on the project that's directed toward your deliverables. That's called the product work. Processes are work too, and it's the same people usually that have to execute those process work. So a lot of times the question is, do you want more product out of your project, or do you want more process out of your project? And that's a question every organization has to answer for itself to set general guidelines. And it's a question that every project manager should put forth and try to pull the team together to answer for every project. So you want to talk about a slider concept, not a binary on or off concept, right? So a slider is a mechanism where at the top of that slider there is very thick process work, a lot of process. And at the bottom of that slider, there's little to none. And the point of a slider with processes, on every process, you take a firm grip on that slider and you move it up and down that scale until you find the sweet spot on that project. For instance, take risk. Every project, it's our belief, firm belief, every project should take risk into consideration. So let's say you have a 1.5-year project with 100 people on it. You're going to want to do a lot of risk analysis. Let's say you have a project with 3 people for 2 weeks. You're not going to spend 6 weeks on risk analysis, right? So instead of ignoring risk, because you cannot execute a thick process that takes hundreds of hours, you simply grab that slider and scoot it down to the point where you can put forth the right, and when I say right, imagine me putting my fingers in the air and making little quote marks, the right amount of risk analysis for that particular project, with that particular team, with that particular set of constraints and assumptions. And it'll be different on every project. And you do the same thing for reporting. You do the same thing for tracking. You do the same thing for planning and scheduling and the amount of process you put around your scope, right? So to summarize the proactive conflict, that simply means put right up on top of the table the work and all the work you think the team should do. That includes product work and process work. And then use that slider as you negotiate with your various stakeholders and constituents to find the sweet spot. Declare it, get sign off, and move on. You'll find that you may get a lot more acknowledgement of a well thought out presentation coming from the team than you will when you just try to, for lack of a better term, weasel out of doing some of the processes because you don't have time or you don't see value. You want to keep it labeled. You want to keep it straight. You want to make sure everybody understands what you're doing so you won't be crosswise in an audit or you won't be crosswise in a project review, or anything like that. You want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Then you'll avoid all the inquisition-like questions that can come along a project, right? Put things on the top of the table, work together. One of the things we've learned is in the picture on the right on your screen is an apparently happy team because they're working on something together. They're not like the team on the left, which has pitted itself in coalitions, one against another, and is arguing instead of working towards something. And just something as simple as using a screen as a focal mechanism instead of pitting somebody against each other sitting across the table is one of the many tactics that you can use to help make that a reality for you. So here, from a PMI, the Project Management Institute, I would assume most people know that, but it's not necessary that everybody does in different industries. Here's what PMI says we do, and here's informal project management. On the left, when people come up with something, you figure out what it is, that's the top box, and you do some amount of planning. You're already doing that now, some amount of planning. Then you talk about it a little bit and you do it. The unspoken PMI way is the top 2 steps are the same. You figure out what needs to be done, you plan it, then you write it down. You write down the steps. You document the process to construct your deliverables. You then negotiate that process all the way to sign off with your major stakeholders. Then you do it. Right? So how is this different? It's different because simply in the fact of writing something down, you will discover more work and more detail that you don't when it's verbal or when it's just in your head. When you negotiate it with your stakeholders, a couple of things will happen. Either they will be surprised and you will end up changing your processes slightly to dramatically, or they will accept your processes. Life goes on just the way it was, and you might think, well, why did I even do this? If we're going to do what I planned anyway, why didn't they just trust me? It's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of individual smart people in a complex environment would do different things to get to the same end, right? People can be all over the place in their processes, and if they don't know what to expect, you'll have a hard time meeting those expectations, right? And only through meeting expectations will you be able to drive to a more trusting, high bandwidth communication relationship. Only by doing what they expect. And how do they know what to expect if you don't talk about it first and get their buy-in? Another side benefit of going through this documenting and signing off on processes instead of just executing is that you'll generally get more participation. People will understand where they or their staff or their peers are needed, and they'll probably be there for you more simply by talking about it than just leaving it in the ethereal, we'll support you, or, just come to us if you need anything. That's a little different than allocating resources for a % of their time or a certain number of hours over a certain time period. You want to bring it from the generic emotional appeal down to the specific with data that can be put in plans and measured in terms of partial FTEs for a project. So this slide is a good demonstration of why nobody hires me to be an artist, but also it demonstrates that regardless of what type of project you have two sorts of work, two types of work. One of those types everybody understands, and it's the product. I've just used an IT example here, but it could be any example, right? It could be anything out there. It could be building a building. It could be merging two companies. It could be buying a piece of property. It could be anything over there. This one just happens to be IT, where there's some specific code, there's tests, you migrate it in production, and then you do the other things to make a product come about. On the left-hand side is a different type of work, no less needed, that has things like planning and estimating and delivering status and having meetings and things like that. If your people are still thinking of these work in two columns, you're going to have a hard time, because it's the same set of people that needs to execute both types of work. If you have a schedule or some other sort of a plan in Excel or whatever, and it only has the right side or the product-oriented work, people, that's just another indicator that process isn't important, right? And on some projects, processes have to work. Some it is, some it isn't. By adding your process steps to your schedule and other planning documents and mechanisms, what you do is you have a holistic view of the project. You can more accurately cost it, and you put emphasis on the processes as well as the product, which is the output of the process. And people will much more likely roll with that and do it as they're assigned than if they feel it's some sort of bureaucratic overhead, extra work that managers just thought up, and it's not really their job. In fact, as we work with clients, we recommend that you talk to somebody who's process-oriented, and as you're building job descriptions and position descriptions for promotion, you make sure that the important processes you want people to execute are labeled in there, not just the output, right? Not just their output. So on any given project, it's acknowledged that you have two types of work, product and process. You need to boil that down to one list. Who decides how much process and how much product work? In your organization, it could be management. In another organization, it could be the project manager or the team. In some of your organizations, the government decides a little bit about what's required, right? Certainly in pharmaceutical, financial industries, even some manufacturing, distribution, there are mandated steps and reports that need to come out from data that's gathered through processes. But there also is probably more flex in the processes that you execute on your projects than you might have anticipated. And we always urge people to try and find where that flex is and shoot for optimum, always, right? So this slide is an example of a slider process. you think of this whenever somebody talks about something like planning, estimating, scheduling, scoping, talking about risk, planning, procurement. You want to grab a hold of that little triangle and move it up and down that arrow. And imagine you hear little clicking sounds where it's going to dial in, right? You talk to your manager, you talk to sponsors, you talk to your team. Maybe you talk to a couple of other project managers who have done management of projects that are similar to this or similar in size or in that organization. And you get a feel for the right amount of process in each particular area. And then once you've decided on the right amount, then you have the next decision on how to provision that with resources. Who's going to do it? How often does it take place? What are the outputs? Right? Once you have those outputs of a process, those are deliverables. They should be migrated to the schedule and listed just like the product deliverables. So this is a tactic that supports the strategy of examining your processes and declaring them before you get fully into a project. And this slider concept can be used in dozens of situations on projects. All projects are not the same. They need to be intelligently balanced, and this is one of the metaphors for the balancing mechanism that you can use. So here is a slide. You're not meant to read the small boxes. This slide, you start out in the center, the blue charter, or whatever originating document. That could be anything like a statement of work, a contract, a scope statement, whatever you call it. There's some document that kicks off a project. Well worth your time to hone that document. That leads into the PMP as a project management plan. That's where you devise and document your processes that you will execute. All the large arrows come about as pieces of that project plan. You have procurement, risk, quality, schedule, scope, the one that's highlighted and emphasized here, cost, HR, communication. Each of those has from 0 to many deliverables. And it's not important the names of those small boxes, right, those small documents. What's important is you think through the various dimensions of your project and use your slider to determine how many deliverables are necessary and what needs to go in on them and what is the level of effort that needs to be wrapped around them to succeed. Right? Once you have that, I think the little pale orange arrow circling the project management plan, that's another set of documents, a very small, called project logs. And project logs might contain such things as action items, issues, decisions, other types of lists that you want to keep track of that are part and parcel of the project but don't really belong in any one of the spheres, right? And then circling that all around is whenever you define a deliverable, the white arrow always comes back to the schedule, which should be the repository for all deliverables, all sub-deliverables, and all effort that should be dedicated to creating those deliverables. Right? So again, you start with the charter, you work your way out to your processes, you negotiate those with your key stakeholders, get those all documented, signed off, then you start executing those processes, usually in parallel to some extent, and out of those processes pops several to many documents and other types of deliverables, which should all be tracked in the schedule. They're all work, they're all necessary, they all have a level of effort, they all have a person responsible for them. How else would you want to track them besides in your schedule? That's definitely a best practice. So please send in any of your questions to James as we go along. Right now, I want to jump to ensuring your processes have value. Right? The first step is what we've talked about a little bit, is tailor those processes. And tailor means everything from drop to add, as well as change, right? Negotiate your team's recommended level of process with your key stakeholders, right? And then start recording some data around your processes. So it could be that people have declared that on your particular project, a good level of effort for risk is the project manager spends half an hour preparing, sets a meeting, representatives from the project team attend, maybe 5 people, they spend an hour and a half, and the project manager follows that up with a document and any recommended changes to the schedule. That's one way of handling that, right? So you then take a look as the project progresses and say, are we getting eaten up by risk events? If not, you'll probably be okay to continue in that manner. If you're being eaten up with risk events, you may decide to take a step back and say, you know what, that wasn't enough time that we allocated to risk analysis, wasn't enough money we spent implementing recommendations of the team from a mitigation perspective, so we're now being eaten up with spending money and time on responses. You may want to grab that slider again, move it up and down that level of effort to find a better place where there's a little bit more effort spent on risk identification and prevention, so that it saves you a lot of time on risk response. Right? You don't just have to do these once. You can reevaluate at any time. The project manager should be able to declare, right now is a good time to take another look at risk because so many things are happening, it doesn't look like we did an adequate job, we better reassess. Kind of go through that same process. Doesn't have to take a long time, but it may go back and take a look. Other ways to ensure process value are to take a look at the inputs and outputs of a process and what are they used for. Are they just simply following some executive directive that they made when something went wrong 25 projects ago? Are they really necessary from a regulatory standpoint? Who would you talk to determine to lessen the impact of these processes on your team? Who's the owner of these processes who could grant you absolution so that you could abstain from executing a process or reduce the level of effort you put on a process and a project? Who is that person that you could talk to, that you could give you permission? That may take a little doing. People may not have looked at things just like that before. They just go on some sort of mandatory list, right? So I've got a little information for you that I gathered from 2 of my clients who, in this case, do not want to be quoted. In one case, I had a bet with the CIO that none of his projects were executing all required mandatory processes. Pardon me. He took me up on that bet, and in 25 minutes conversation with one person, I was able to identify one of his major projects that was not executing 2 processes that were mandatory. What's happened is that somehow, in many of our environments, the process to declare a mandatory process has been too easy. It's been the easy way out when there's a problem on a project to try to set up another process, another layer of governance, another report in order, in the well-meaning attempt that you never want to see that problem happen again, right? However, if you do that very often, you know, how often do people go back and delete processes? Not very often. So this is an add-only situation for the most part, and those things add up over time, right? If every single problem on every single project results in a new process, or even just the big ones, these things can get out of control really quickly. So what we're faced with is a situation in which, excuse me, nobody can execute all the mandatory processes at the level that someone wishes you to. So we're, in effect, unilaterally trying to skirt the issue by either giving lip service to some processes or by just ignoring them and hoping nobody asks us about them, right? We've all been there in organizations where so many people want you to do so many things that it's literally impossible to do them all and still get any project work done. There are really visceral reasons for good processes, right? What are some of those reasons? What are some of the values? Well, from some perspective, you execute some processes to keep your executives out of jail. I think they'd agree and we'd agree that's a valid use of time, right? From a project perspective, though, the reason to execute a process is because it saves the project time and allows the project to build a better product or more of a product or build it quicker, right? Saves time, increases quality, saves cost. So if the cost of a process is less than the cost of not doing a process, you should probably do the process. So with that simple guideline in mind, on each particular project, you look at your domain of processes that you might execute. There's hundreds. And you hold them up one by one and say, what is the time or the cost or the quality benefit from this process? What is the cost of executing the process? And if it comes out to the good, you want to execute it as infrequently and lightly as possible to get the benefit. If it comes up negative, it should go on the list to negotiate with your key stakeholders and say, on this project, for the following reasons, we estimate this process will take N number of hours from N people, resulting in a total of NN hours at a cost of XX dollars for a total of YY. And the benefit is smaller than the cost. We respectfully submit that we should not execute that process and see what the reaction is. And if you have two options here. One is construct your plan, making the assumptions that your process request will be approved, or making the assumptions that your process request will be denied. So then, if you take the effect that it will be denied, what you show them when you're presenting this is, if we take this process out, here's how much sooner we could do the project, or here's how many fewer hours we would expend, or fewer dollars, or whatever the benefit is, right? The other way is you show the plan with your assumptions baked in. Then if they want to add back in, you quickly do that right in the meeting and show how that dollar bar moves upward and that timeline scoots out, or the quality drops in such a manner that to make sure that they are getting intended consequences and not unintended consequences. Because the days of people having time to do things because it's just the right thing to do or it's good for the organization, those days are over. Everything we have to do has to have value at this point. And that's the way to get ahead. A competitive advantage for your organization is to make sure everybody is working on the highest value tasks that they possibly can. Right? So another way to look at this in tailoring your processes is list all the processes that you're expected to execute or oversee executing on your project. Rank them in priority order, assign some ROI, blend in the actual product work. Now you really have what's like a mini schedule or a high-level schedule, the one list, right? Leave some room for changes and defects or whatever else creeps in your environment. And then take a look at it and map that against your available resources. And I can pretty much guarantee that you will have some of those items drop below the line at which it's possible for you to resource them under the current parameters or constraints of the project. So if you use that as the fulcrum for your discussions, you can then say, okay, here's some things that dropped out. If you want us to do them, there's two ways to do that, right? Increase the resources or extend the schedule, adapt the project to what you want to be done, or acknowledge that those things aren't as important as everything else on top of it in the list, and agree that those things will not be done on this project. But again, you need to do that up on top of the table, but that doesn't mean in a meeting. Right? One aspect of this that you might consider is that you never want to spring this type of thing on people in a meeting. You want to get with them privately first, get their reaction, get their agreement on how to proceed. Then when you have a meeting, it's simply more or less a ratification. Do not spring things like this on people in a meeting. Okay, we've talked about this. This just to remind you to use that slider in your negotiation. Which projects are needed, what level of effort. Right, so one of the things that I see growing, the areas of growth that's bad, is more and more and more governance and status, right? There's only really one reason to provide status other than compliance reasons. And that reason is to feed the decision process, right? To feed the decision process. You only want to report data that's directly used to make current decisions. And as you're going through, you'll need to adapt your processes to give you that data, to make those decisions, to give your management that data, right? You want to make sure that there's a written or unwritten contract with your staff on the project and any vendors that guarantees you get status when you need it in the way that the project can consume it, right? And people will more likely deal with this if you can sort of trade them by reducing some other overhead to compensate for their time. And then this is a big one for managers and project managers. Once you've set up your statusing mechanisms and you know what you need to do, you have to discipline yourself to reward people when they come forth with problems and bad news, not punish them or shun them. And I've seen both those tactics used with horrible failure rates. When people from one side of their mouth are saying, get me a bunch of data, and from the other side of their mouth, they're using that data to punish the people that get them that data, that's not being consistent. You're not rewarding them for getting that data, you're punishing them. So we have to think about that, right? Another way to think about this is setting thresholds to take specific actions. If you know your project well and your constituents, you'll be able to define default corrective actions. And in those actions, all else remaining equal, when something happens to disturb the project, this is what you'll probably do. Now, it takes quite a bit of upfront negotiation. That's where a little bit of that conflict comes from. But it's better than doing it every time something happens for the life of the project, right? And if you're going to do all this, you're gathering some data, you're going to want to build in some analysis time, right? And that includes taking a look at any metrics that you have agreed on, and not just looking at them, but building time in your schedule to do the analysis of those metrics and to take improving or corrective actions, right? Everybody wants to do that. You just get in too big of a rush. You shouldn't have any metrics on your project without a corresponding amount of time to analyze and make corrections based on those metrics. That's why you have them, right? Just for posterity? Who has time for that? The only metrics, every metric you have on your project, there should at some point in your project, and possibly multiple times, be built in a short amount of time with the right people, fully resourced, to take a look at those metrics. Think about the processes to adapt, and actually take the time to adapt those processes and perform change management to make sure that they are adopted, that the processes are adopted after they're changed. That time needs to be in your schedule. So what do you expect when you start in on a process like this, right? Well, you can get all the metrics you like and put all the electronics and automation in place, and it's still people to get work done, right? Anything you come up with is a change, and they won't want to unless you help them understand through some presentations and one-on-ones, along with some directives that have to be in alignment with project managers, supervisors, managers, executives. And some common sense is needed, right? Don't try to lather on practices across the board without taking the relevant change management steps. We see clients fail all the time in implementing some process because they just sort of decree it. They don't provide any extra time. What that feels like in the trenches is an unfunded mandate. They're asked to do yet more work. They don't see the benefit. They don't understand why it's taking place. It's pretty easy to ignore, right? And don't be afraid to adapt your processes to mesh with what your people do and what they expect. So, before we dive into some questions, if people have them there, I'll just do a quick summary. So the big message is tailor your processes and then negotiate those processes, whether or not you should execute them and at what level. Use your slider, right? Talk to your key people, both the governance side and the performing side, and figure out where's the biggest benefit, where's the optimal benefit, and negotiate around that. Back up your negotiations with how long it's going to take to perform these processes, and use point counterpoint with the amount of work people want to spend on process versus product, the level of staffing, and do that up on top of the table, right? And for your processes, on what's important, set your metrics, record that data, right? And then take the extra step, which is really productive, to bake a little bit of time in your schedule to step back, review those processes, check the data, adapt the processes, use your change management to drive that in your organization, right? And from time to time, reevaluate the ROI you're really getting out of your processes. Just because you thought that something was going to be valuable doesn't mean it turns out to be valuable. That doesn't have to be a one-time step. If it feels like you're executing something that's relatively useless on a project, document that and bring it up to people and try to make a change, to buy back that time, to put on processes that do provide value, that have proven value. Wanted to let you know just a few of the inputs to this process that we've developed over the years and that what we try to help our clients implement, right? Agile and integrated project management takes in hundreds of years of learning from these organizations and many of our clients. We look for bright spots in our clients' activities, and we try to generalize those and help those clients push that across the organization. And when it's appropriate from an intellectual property standpoint, we pull that process into our toolkit. For instance, one of our clients came up with a great notion that they were trying to push everyone to do work on their documents online. And so as part and parcel of that, when a document from a project repository is printed, it automatically gets a chunk on the front of it that says, if you're holding a printed document, it's probably out of date, you should go online. words to that effect. That's a great indicator, very inexpensive, that just keeps people focused on these documents. Many of them on projects are living, breathing documents. People may be updating them, in some instances, from around the world 24 hours a day. If you're holding a document that you printed some number of days or weeks ago, there's a great chance that document's out of date. And what better way to show that? We ask permission, and now we can use that tactic in presentations such as this. That's how we get a lot of our best practices, with permission, from helping clients work through and maximize and optimize their processes, and then we can bring those to the table for our various engagements. So at this point, I'd like to take any and all questions, any comments. James, can you help funnel those in, and we'll see what people have to say. Love to, and we've baked into this process the time to address questions, so right now's the time.
Thanks, Darryl. Yeah, we've got some folks going ahead and sending their questions through. I would encourage you, if you've not done so already, go ahead and click on the questions tab and submit your questions for Darryl, and we'll get to as many of these as we can in our remaining time. Darryl, let's dive right on in. Our first question comes in from Randy. Randy says, I've got a VP that is constantly telling me that there are hard date deadlines on my projects. How do I communicate to him I guess what he's referring to is the triple constraint? You know, what takes priority?
Randy, that's a great question. And we've had a little inflation over the past years, and that extends to the triple constraint. We now call it a pentagon. It has 5 somewhat equal sides: scope, time, cost, resources, and quality. That's scope, time, cost, resources, and quality. And we added resources and quality because in today's world, resources in terms of people are usually one of the constraining factors. So that demands a promotion from an emphasis perspective, so we talk about the people with scarce skills to perform these. And quality is the loser. Many times in a situation like that, where the jargon for that is the executive saying we have to time box the work, which is we have to allocate a specific amount of time to get that work done, and time is the least flexible attribute, right? So some of the ways to do that is take a look at the other facets of the pentagon besides time, which are scope, cost, quality, and resources, and say, from a colloquial perspective, you've got 10 pounds of stuff, whatever you want to call it, and a 5-pound bag, right? Which of that stuff do you want me to cram in there? And I can kind of pile it up over the top, but at some point, some's going to spill. What we need to focus the discussion on is what is the stuff that spills, right? So if a colloquial approach works, that's one way to go about it. Another approach is to construct a spreadsheet, which could be a Microsoft project schedule or any other scheduling, more modern scheduling tool, whatever, and put all the work on it and all the resources with the estimates of time that the resources think is going to take, which is probably going to bypass the hard date, and negotiate with the team and say, look, we have to meet this date. What is our best recommendation to go to management with for the concessions that we'll have to make in 1 to 4 of the project dimensions mentioned around the pentagon? Do we want to lower the quality? And while that might be somewhat distasteful, that happens in software all the time. I can't count how many times I've heard, well, let's just do it. We'll fix it in production. Right? So that's a business decision. It's not a good and evil decision. It's a business decision. At other times, when faced with a dramatic decision to say, if we need to get it done at this level of quality in this time frame, then we need to spend some money and get some contractors in here, or outsource a piece of it to a vendor, freeing up our internal resources to work on the rest, or any other type of acknowledged mechanism to make that happen. And sometimes they say, okay, here's the money. Other times it's a resource issue. You may have a project team and you look over across the cubicle farm there, and you see a couple of people that are more experienced, you can say, with this current team, unless we add or swap out resources with more experience, we'll have to cut the scope by some amount. We won't be able to do the whole thing. We'll be able to do 3/4 of it by the date. And so the basic message is provide some data in a way that's best consumable, and there's no perfect here, best consumable by the people that will be making that decision, and frame your conversation around trade-offs, not around loyalty and emotional attachment to the project or anything like that, around this. These are the resources we have to put in place. Here's a couple of scenarios recommended by the team that I agree with, that we could meet your date if we did this or this, or we could meet your date if we did this or this, or we could meet the scope if we extended the date, or we could stick to the resources if we cut scope, or whatever it is. I'd always phrase it in terms of trade-off. And just one more point on this is, I feel like you're going to have a lot more luck if you have a document that you can put in front of somebody and sort of come around and get on the same side of the table and focus on the document with some data and recommendations than it is in putting you in a position of just saying no. Right? Do your analysis. Be as unemotional as possible, just presenting facts with a recommendation for the team and letting them know that you'll do anything they want. And here's how you view the world at this point. I mean, that's a great question. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darryl. That was a good response. A lot of folks struggle with that triple constraint or the pentagon constraint, as you pointed out. We've got a couple more minutes left. We're going to try to get to as many of these as we can. Richard jumps in and asks a question. He says, what types of statements yield results against stubborn producers? And he uses the examples of some coders, stakeholders, engineers. You talked about those statements that yield results. What works with those stubborn guys?
Okay, I need just a tad more context on that. I don't quite know how to answer that.
All right. Well, Richard, if you want to chime in and give us some context, I'll come back to your question. I've got a couple of folks, Darryl, that have jumped in and said, in your perspective, what is the real role of the PMO? I mean, if you whittled it all down to the brass tacks, what is their responsibility?
Okay, so this, I have to ask permission to speak freely, right? Because this sort of flies in the face. I've read about 9 books on PMOs, and I've talked with lots of people. My feeling is that the PMO, to be successful long-term, and I'm just speaking from my experience observing PMOs in many, many organizations, should not be a compliance arm. The PMO should not be a compliance arm. That's not to say that they can't be involved and help. Let me describe the scenario in which the PMO can remain a valued partner. An executive, for whatever reason, creates a directive for organizational units to perform a process or contribute some data via something like a status. The executive communicates directly with their direct reports. Their direct reports communicate directly with the projects and the operations that are asked to perform this type of operation. And then they say, as they're giving them the direct instruction that should be backed up by performance measures to the business units, to the organizational units, then they might say, and the people in the PMO know how to do this really well. You might want to talk to them to help you get this done. Rather than an executive in a somewhat secret meeting talks to the PMO director, the PMO VP, and says, here's what I want you to go out and make everybody do. Right? The PMO doesn't own the business units. They can't make anybody do anything. All they can do is threaten them with reporting restrictions, that is essentially the kiss of death. Right there is when you know you have a temporary PMO, and at some point, perhaps in the near future, you're going to be going through a reforming exercise. Don't let the PMO become a channel for executive decree. Have executives make their decrees directly to the operational units with a reference to the PMO as the experts to help them get her done. That's what I've got. And I think we're out of time, but I'd be happy to stick around.
Thanks, Darryl. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that, because I know you're under a tight time constraint, we're at the top of the hour. I've got some more questions coming through, and I'm not sure we're going to have time for those. Do you have another minute or two, Darryl, or do you need to run?
Oh, I can take another minute. Sure.
Well, Richard came back on board to try to clarify his original question, so let's see if we can get to that one. Richard says, having been assigned a task, some stubborn producers fail to yield results. Are there proven statements or phrases using language that would particularly motivate those folks?
Okay, so here's some things that I do, right? Not knowing exactly the situation. I understand I've had lots of people tell me, you know, I don't know how long it's going to take. It'll be done when it's done. And I don't know what kind of quality it's going to have. I'll get to what I can. I've also had people exhibit characteristics that I'll name as selective memory, right? Where you think you have agreement, you go away, you come back, and they're sort of stalling now and pretending that that conversation didn't take place. Either they actually forgot or they are pretending to forget because of the pressures of the day have redirected them in some way, right? So sometimes I've taken the person aside and helped them from a time management perspective, right? It could be as simple as helping them list out all their tasks that they owe everybody, putting them in the order they think they ought to be executing those tasks, and then helping them negotiate with their manager. This does two things. That sets you up as the role of a mentor with people and sort of intervening and helping people get organized, and it also ensures that you get your 2 cents in when you're trying to dial in the priorities on those tasks along with that person's manager, supervisor, and the person and the resource. So that's one way, right? Become a mentor and help them from a time management perspective. You'll tend to get a tad bit more attention than other people who aren't doing that, right? Other times I've asked to have that person transferred to the project, officially transferred for the duration of the project or their duration of their work on the project. That can work sometimes. Other times, when there's a little bit of a conflict going on, you know, we use the concept of project logs that are in a publicly available space, such as SharePoint or Google Docs or whatever sort of collaborative environment the organization supports or allows use of. And then whenever we're talking to somebody about some sort of commitment, we open up one of those files and we record the commitment and some of the background information in a public document. And then as we're documenting, like say it's a requirement, right? You record something about a requirement, and we flip over to the schedule, which should also be public to the extent that that's appropriate for at least the team, if not others. And then we record the information as we see it, and we negotiate right there, and we put it on the schedule, including assigning target and deadline dates and what happens at these dates and who the backup is for this. And it just sort of makes it real, aside from just sending somebody an email or having a conversation or whatever. So those are 3 different tactics, right? Mentoring through time management, ensuring that you get your 2 cents in. Formalizing it by documenting, and then using the public project repository, for lack of a better word, to ensure that things are up there and recorded in a public manner. In fact, we suggest that people use tools like the Citrix webinar and other tools, GoToWebinar, and other types of screen sharing tools for distributed teams so that everybody's looking at the same thing at the same time, and there's not the ability to kind of slough off tasks when something comes around for review you can sort of maneuver and interpret it differently. Rather do it all at once. It's a little slower initially, but it cuts down on the review cycles. So I hope that helps.
Boy, that's real helpful, Darryl. I think next time we just need to make some more time for questions, because you tend to really get into the nuts and bolts with the actual scenarios. Thank you for your feedback on that. Well, we have run short on time, and there are some questions still coming through, so I would ask you to continue to send those across, and if we can't get to those, we'll see if we can respond to you by email and get you an answer to your question. I want to say thanks to Darryl Raynor for participating today. Great information. Darryl's he's done a couple of these webinars for us. He's going to be doing another webinar for us next month, and probably multiples more. In addition to Darryl, we've got half a dozen other professionals out there that are helping us with the webinar series. I would encourage you to go to our website to register for any of the other webinars. A couple of the topics we've got going on right now are 3 critical components of project success. What does it take to be a great project manager? How to implement an enterprise PMO for competitive advantage, how to turn around failing projects. That's just a sampling of some of the other webinars we've got going on. What do? We help you with per person, per project profitability. Our goal is to help you with what's on the screen there, cross-project resource optimization. So if you're having difficulty figuring out who's doing what, when will they be finished, and who's available for the next project, that's what Jernix Project Execute does. So you can visit our website and get more information. We also have a live demo every Wednesday for 30 minutes. We'd be happy to have you. Again, we appreciate you taking your time to spend with us today. We hope that all your projects will be successful, and hope you'd have a great day today. Thanks again.